You ever hear a jet ask for help? Lieutenant Connor Reeves said it with a crooked grin, loud enough for the flight deck crew to laugh, but the laugh died fast beneath the scream of salt wind and the low mechanical groan rolling through the catapult track. The USS Resolute cut through black Atlantic swells under a moon veiled by sea haze, her flight deck lit in amber and red, every steel surface trembling with tension. At Catapult 3, an F-18 Super Hornet crouched under launch power like a predator held on a chain, twin tails shivering in the rotor wash of distant deck traffic, but something was wrong. The launch control panel showed green across every diagnostic line, hydraulic pressure nominal, electronic checks clean, engine temperature steady, and still the shuttle would not engage. 90 seconds remained before the mission had to be scrubbed. Reeves stood rigid in his cranial helmet, sweat moving cold beneath his collar despite the ocean chill, staring at numbers that made no sense. Around him, young technicians moved with clipped urgency, plugging in tablets, checking harness couplings, rerunning fault trees that came back empty. Everything was perfect, and nothing worked. That was when the old man appeared at the edge of the deck lights as though the sea itself had given him up. Elias Mercer stood in a faded green deck jacket older than some aircraft aboard, a worn patch barely clinging to one shoulder, silver hair moving in the wind, pale eyes fixed not on the crew but on the silent jet. He did not seem impressed by the alarms, the shouting, or the urgency burning through the deck. He simply watched. Reeves noticed him and shook his head in disbelief. "Who let a museum piece onto my flight line?" he muttered, drawing scattered smirks. Mercer stepped closer without hurry, boots scraping softly over non-skid coating, his gaze traveling over the catapult shuttle, the nose strut, the intake hum, as though listening to something beneath the noise. "Admiral Keegan asked me to look," he said, voice gravel low, almost swallowed by wind. Reeves gave a humorless laugh. "With 45 seconds to abort, I don't need folklore. I need my bird airborne." "But..." Mercer did not answer. He stopped beside the jet's port side, staring at a panel no one else had touched twice because every system swore it was healthy. Petty Officer Mason Cole noticed the old man's expression change, subtle as a tide shifting. Not fear. Recognition. Mercer lifted one hand, old fingers scarred and steady, resting lightly against warm metal as if greeting an old companion. The deck lights flashed amber over his weathered face. Reeves barked for another diagnostic sweep, but Cole's attention stayed fixed on Mercer. The old man leaned toward the panel, so close his lips nearly brushed steel, and whispered a single word. "Bleed." The word was almost lost in the wind, so soft Cole wondered if he imagined it. Reeves frowned. "What did you say?" Mercer straightened slowly, eyes never leaving the jet. "She's choking." Somewhere beneath the roar of turbines, a memory seemed to pass through his gaze, ancient and heavy. 30 seconds remained. Catapult chains rattled. Deck crews froze in a strange silence none could explain. And for the first time that night, Connor Reeves felt something colder than failure moving across the flight deck. Connor Reeves had heard old chiefs mutter that machines developed moods at sea, that steel remembered pressure, salt, and human error in ways manuals could not explain, but he had always dismissed it as superstition dressed in Navy romance. Yet standing beneath the pulsing deck lights, staring at Elias Mercer's unmoving face, he felt the certainty of procedure beginning to slip. "She is choking," Reeves repeated with disbelief, the words tasting absurd even as the countdown clock burned down toward abort. "That aircraft has redundant purge systems. There is nothing choking." Mercer turned only slightly, enough for the younger man to catch the hard stillness in pale blue eyes sharpened by things Reeves could not name. "You trust what the screens tell you," Mercer said quietly. "I trust what the jet is trying to say." Around them, technicians exchanged glances half amused, half uneasy. A petty officer near the diagnostics cart gave a nervous chuckle. Reeves did not laugh. Something in the old man's tone carried no challenge, no need to prove itself, and that unsettled him more than arrogance would have. 24 seconds. Deck chains clattered against steel. Somewhere aft, another fighter rolled under tow, its wheels humming over tie-down plates. Mason Cole stepped closer to Mercer. "What does bleed mean?" he asked, almost in a whisper. Mercer lifted one weathered finger toward a flush inspection panel beneath the intake, a panel every technician had ignored because it looked flawless. "There is pressure trapped where it should not be." Reeves folded his arms. "That panel passed every check." Mercer gave the faintest nod. "That is why nobody looked inside." The words landed heavier than they should have. Reeves felt irritation rise, partly at the old man, partly at himself for listening. Even if you are right, opening a factory-sealed purge valve on a live launch bird would violate every protocol on this deck. Mercer looked back toward the F-18, listening again to the turbine whine. "Protocol is written after somebody survives a mistake." Mason felt something move in his chest at that sentence, something older than rank. 12 seconds. The launch crew chief shouted abort prep. Hands moved toward shutdown sequence. Then Mercer did something so small Reeves nearly missed it. He stepped to the panel, rested his palm flat against the metal skin, and closed his eyes for one breath. The ocean wind pressed against his jacket. The faded patch on his shoulder lifted, revealing the worn ghost of old squadron markings. Mason saw it and frowned, recognition stirring without shape. Mercer opened his eyes. "Open it." Reeves stared as though struck. "What?" "Open the bleed manifold." "There is no time." "There is exactly enough." The certainty in the old man's voice cut through the panic like a blade through rope. Mason moved before thinking, reaching for tools. Reeves grabbed his arm. "Stand down." But hesitation had already entered the chain of command, and hesitation at sea was contagious. From the bridge above, unseen by them, a watch officer had noticed the aborted launch and picked up a secure phone. Far above the deck, in flag quarters lit by dim red lamps, a name had just been spoken into Rear Admiral Thomas Keegan's ear. Elias Mercer. And in the span of one heartbeat, the Admiral rose so fast his chair struck the bulkhead behind him. Rear Admiral Thomas Keegan did not ask for clarification. He did not ask whether the report was certain, or why a retired troubleshooter was standing on an active carrier deck in the middle of a launch emergency. He was already moving before the officer on the secure line finished speaking. On the flight deck below, none of them knew that yet. They only felt the strange pause that comes when routine begins to bend. Lieutenant Connor Reeves still gripped Mason Cole's arm, but less firmly now, as if his own certainty had lost pressure. The old man had not raised his voice, had not argued rank, had not tried to impress anyone, and somehow that made resistance harder. Mercer looked from Reeves to the sealed panel. "You have 6 seconds before the purge backfeeds," he said. "After that, you do not launch tonight." Reeves hated that part of him believed it. He hated even more that he could not explain why. He released Mason. "Open it." The words came out rough, almost against his will. Mason dropped to one knee by the access panel, hands moving fast with a driver as salt wind pressed against his sleeves. The first screw came loose. Then another. The steel cover lifted barely an inch before a soft hiss escaped from within, a breath of trapped pressure no diagnostic computer had seen. Reeves froze. So did the nearest technicians. Nobody laughed now. Mercer leaned in, listening as if hearing a voice inside machinery older than anyone there. "There," he murmured. "Blocked bleed line." His hand reached into the faded jacket and withdrew a small leather pouch so worn it seemed made from memory itself. The snap opened with a dry click. Inside lay tools so simple they looked almost out of place beside modern avionics tablets. A narrow custom wrench, polished by decades of use. Mason stared. "You carried that aboard?" Mercer answered without looking up. "I have carried it for 58 years. The old wrench touched a recessed fitting no one had noticed. One careful turn. Then another. A sharper hiss sang through the manifold. The jet gave a sudden low shudder through its frame. Console lights flickered. One of the technicians shouted, stunned, "Hydraulic pressure is stabilizing." Reeves spun toward the diagnostic screen, disbelief widening in him. Readings that had been flat now moved into alignment as though a hidden knot had slipped free. But Mercer was gone from the deck in his mind. For an instant his pale eyes drifted somewhere far beyond Atlantic darkness. Mason saw it happen. The old man was not looking at an F-18 anymore. He was somewhere lit by carrier fire decades earlier, where another flight deck rolled under storm rain and younger hands worked against failing pressure while pilots waited on catapults built before Connor Reeves had been born. Mercer's thumb brushed the old wrench as if touching a relic. "Same sound," he whispered. "Same lie in the gauges." The memory passed, but its weight lingered. Then a new sound rose over the wind. Running boots. Heads turned. A line of officers was crossing the deck at impossible speed, led by Rear Admiral Keegan himself, cap in hand, coat open in the sea gusts. Flight crew instinctively stepped aside. Reeves felt the blood drain from his face. Admirals did not run onto launch decks for routine faults. Keegan stopped not at the fighter, not at the diagnostics cart, but directly before Elias Mercer. For one suspended second the deck seemed to hold its breath. Then the Admiral's posture changed. His shoulders squared. His chin lifted. And before anyone understood why, Thomas Keegan came sharply to attention in front of the forgotten old man. No one on Catapult 3 moved. The wind still crossed the deck in hard salt gusts, chains still rattled against steel, turbines still whined in their restless pitch, yet everything seemed suspended around the impossible sight before them. Rear Admiral Thomas Keegan stood rigid at attention before Elias Mercer, the kind of posture men gave flags and fallen heroes, not a quiet old civilian in a faded jacket. Lieutenant Connor Reeves felt the shape of his world tilt. Every instinct trained into him told him he was missing a truth larger than rank. Keegan held the salute a heartbeat longer than protocol required, then lowered his hand with something close to reverence. "Chief Mercer," he said, voice carrying over the deck noise with calm authority, "I should have met you at the gangway." No one breathed. Mason Cole stared as if the ocean itself had spoken. Reeves managed, "Sir, this man is a retired contractor." Keegan turned, and there was iron in his gaze. "This man," he said, "kept naval aviation alive when textbooks ran out of answers." The words moved through the deck crew like electrical current. Mercer gave a faint, almost embarrassed shake of his head. "The bird is not fixed yet. Even now, no pride. Only the aircraft mattered." Keegan looked at the open panel. "Then show them." Mercer crouched again beside the bleed manifold, old wrench in hand, and motioned Mason closer. "Listen before you touch," he said. Mason leaned in. The hiss had changed, softer now, rhythmic, like a breath recovering. Mercer adjusted the recessed fitting another quarter turn. "Pressure lies when it is trapped. Sound does not." Reeves watched, silent now, his earlier mockery burning in memory. Something about the old man's hands unsettled him most. They moved without hurry, but with the confidence of someone returning to a conversation interrupted decades ago. Mercer touched a narrow bypass tube. That touch became a trigger. For an instant his pale eyes clouded again, and the flight deck dissolved in memory. Rain hammered another carrier deck under a black Pacific sky. Signal lamps swung through storm spray. A younger Mercer, sleeves rolled, crouched over a crippled launch bird while a young pilot waited strapped in, gloved thumb raised through a fogged canopy. "She breathes through the bleed when she cannot trust fuel," a chief's old voice echoed from the past. Mercer had learned it then, not from manuals but from men who listened to machines the way sailors listen to storms. The memory slipped away as quickly as it came. He looked at Mason. "Now close the valve." Mason obeyed. Diagnostics screens jumped. A technician shouted, unable to hide awe, launch sequence restored. The words rippled through stunned faces. Reeves stepped toward Mercer. Struggling for language. Why did no one teach us this? Mercer looked almost sad. Because experience retires faster than memory should. Keegan heard it and his jaw tightened. That ends tonight. Then he turned to Reeves. Prepare this aircraft for launch. The order snapped the young lieutenant back into motion. Crews surged to stations, but their energy had changed. Not frantic now. Focused. Respectful. Reeves hesitated once more, then faced Mercer. Sir, why did you whisper, bleed, instead of just telling us? A faint line touched the old man's mouth. Because if I had explained it first, you would have argued. Even Keegan gave the shadow of a smile. Then from the cockpit came the pilot's signal. Engines rose in a deeper, steadier roar. Catapult 3 hummed alive beneath their boots. And as amber launch lights reflected in sea mist, Connor Reeves realized the old man everyone had nearly dismissed had not merely saved a mission. He had just made an entire flight deck question what else they had forgotten. The deck crew moved with a different rhythm now, as though the carrier itself had shifted under a new gravity. The old laughter was gone. Every glance toward Elias Mercer held the unsettled respect men reserve for something they do not yet understand. Lieutenant Connor Reeves took his launch position beside Catapult 3, but his attention kept drifting to the old troubleshooter standing near the open manifold, leather pouch still in hand. The F-18 crouched under full readiness, engines rising in a smooth predatory whine that no longer carried strain. Green lights marched across the launch console. For the first time that night, everything aligned. Yet Rear Admiral Keegan did not leave. He remained beside Mercer as if the launch itself were secondary to the man who had made it possible. Reeves noticed and felt another question forming. Admirals did not linger for mechanics. They lingered for history. Catapult charged, the shooter called. The pilot saluted from the cockpit. Reeves returned it automatically, but before he dropped his arm, Keegan spoke low enough only Mercer and those nearest could hear. You used the old correction from the Coral Sea. Trials. Mason Cole looked up sharply. That procedure is not in fleet manuals. Mercer answered, it used to be. His thumb traced the worn edge of the custom wrench, and once again his gaze drifted far beyond the Atlantic night. The smell of jet fuel became in memory the sharper scent of hot deck steel under tropical rain. He was 21 again, crouched beside a trembling launch bird while a young lieutenant in a helmet too large for his face looked at him through the canopy. That pilot had been Thomas Keegan, decades before stars adorned his shoulders. Their aircraft had shown the same false diagnostics, the same trapped pressure hidden behind perfect readings. A senior chief beside Mercer had leaned close and said, when the gauges lie, listen for the breath. It was the first time Mercer had heard the word bleed spoken as a kind of secret language. Then memory faded under the living roar of engines. You remembered, Keegan said quietly, almost not as an admiral but as a man repaying a debt. Mercer gave a faint shrug. Jets remember too. Reeves heard that and felt a chill he could not explain. The shooter's hand dropped. Steam burst. Catapult 3 released with a thunderous shove. The F-18 shot forward down steel track and vanished into black ocean sky, afterburners painting brief gold against sea mist before becoming a distant star over dark water. No one spoke for several breaths. Even seasoned deck hands watched in silence as though witnessing more than a launch. Then cheers rose, restrained at first, then spreading in rough Navy grins. A technician who had mocked Mercer earlier removed his gloves and simply stared at the old man. Reeves walked toward him slowly. I owe you an apology. Mercer studied him for a moment, then shook his head. No. You owe your crew curiosity. The sentence struck harder than reprimand. Mason looked at the worn patch on Mercer's shoulder again. Under flaking thread he could finally make out a faded insignia from a squadron long decommissioned. Ghost Squadron 7, he whispered. Keegan heard him. They called them the Whisper Crew. Reeves frowned. Why? Keegan's eyes stayed on Mercer. Because when every system failed, they fixed things with one quiet word. Before Reeves could ask more, an alarm tone sounded from a nearby console. A maintenance chief ran up, face drained. Sir, Catapult 1 just locked up. Same fault signature. The deck seemed to pause again. Every eye turned toward Mercer. He closed the leather pouch with a soft snap, looked toward the dark end of the carrier where red warning lights flashed through salt haze, and with the calm of a man returning to unfinished work, began walking into the wind. Catapult 1 lay 200 yards forward in a wash of crimson warning lights and salt spray, its launch track dead, another fighter frozen on the bow like a predator denied the leap. But now the flight deck did not react with panic. It reacted with expectation, because Elias Mercer was walking toward the fault and everyone knew it. Lieutenant Connor Reeves moved beside him without being asked, no trace of mockery left in his face. Mason Cole followed carrying the old leather pouch as though entrusted with something ceremonial. Rear Admiral Keegan came too, ignoring every rule that said flag officers should not crowd active launch zones. The crew at Catapult 1 parted before Mercer the way sailors part for heavy weather. A senior maintenance chief met them with a tablet in trembling hands. Identical fault code, sir. We reran diagnostics 3 times. Mercer did not take the tablet. Then the problem is not in the diagnostics. He knelt beside the shuttle track, placed his palm against the steel guide rail, and listened again in that strange way of his, as though machinery held memory in vibration. Reeves watched, fascinated now. How do you know where to look without schematics? Mercer answered without lifting his eyes. Because systems fail in habits. The word stayed with Reeves. A phrase from another century somehow more precise than software. Mercer pointed toward a pressure relay tucked beneath an armored housing. Not bleed this time. Resonance lock. The younger technicians exchanged confused glances. One muttered he had never heard the term. Keegan did. Carrier launch oscillation, the Admiral said quietly, almost with awe. They stopped. Teaching that after analog controls vanished. Mercer gave the faintest nod. Machines did not stop remembering it. Mason handed him the custom wrench. The old man held it a moment, thumb resting on the worn metal, and another memory flickered across his face. Sunlight over Pacific swells. A younger deck crew sweating over a launch rail vibrating itself into deadlock. A chief with silver at his temples saying, "Steel sings before it seizes." Mercer had listened then. He listened now. He adjusted a hidden coupling 1 fraction. A low hum shifted beneath the deck, subtle but unmistakable. The carrier itself seemed to exhale. Technicians looked at one another in disbelief as fault indicators cleared one by one. Reeves stared at the green lights and shook his head slowly. We had an entire systems team missing what you found by touch. Mercer stood. You were listening for data. I was listening for distress. The sentence spread through the nearby crew in silence. It sounded less like mechanics and more like doctrine. Then something unexpected happened. A young aviation electrician stepped forward, removed the challenge coin from his pocket, and pressed it into Mercer's hand. For the deck, sir, he said softly. Others followed, small gestures of Navy respect no one had ordered. Keegan watched it unfold with wet brightness in his eyes he hid beneath hard command bearing. Launch restored, the maintenance chief called. Another fighter rolled ready. Reeves turned to Mercer. Why did they call you the Whisper Crew? Mercer looked toward black ocean beyond the bow. Because shouting is for panic. Whispering means you still understand the machine. Before Reeves could answer, a secure runner hurried across the deck. Admiral, message from Combat Information Center. Keegan read the slip, and his expression changed. Not alarm. Recognition. He looked at Mercer. They are requesting a launch advisory from Flag. Mercer frowned. From me? Keegan folded the message once. No, Chief. From the man who taught me how to bring crippled birds home. Around them the second fighter signaled ready. Catapult 1 charged alive beneath their boots. But Connor Reeves realized the greater reversal had already happened. The forgotten old man they had nearly mocked off the deck was no longer a relic among them. On this carrier, in this night wind over black Atlantic water, he had become the standard everyone else was measuring themselves against. Catapult 1 thundered alive and sent the waiting fighter into the Atlantic night, but the applause that followed was quieter now, almost reverent, as though the crew sensed they were standing inside a story larger than a launch recovery. Elias Mercer did not seem to notice. He was looking toward the dark horizon where the departing jet had vanished, face lit in alternating amber and red from deck lamps, the old leather pouch resting under one arm like something he had carried through entire lifetimes. Rear Admiral Thomas Keegan folded the message from Combat Information Center and held it in his palm a moment before speaking. They want a launch advisory because Strike Package 2 is entering weather. Mercer's pale eyes narrowed toward low storm bands gathering beyond the bow. Crosswinds over the recovery corridor, he said before seeing any report. Reeves looked at him sharply. How would you know that? Mercer tilted his head, listening to the wind crossing the island superstructure. Because the sea already told us. It was said without mysticism, only habit, but it silenced everyone near him. Keegan turned to Reeves. Bring him to primary flight control. Reeves blinked. Sir, regulations do not allow. Tonight, Keegan cut in, we are already operating beyond regulations. Minutes later they climbed steel ladders into the dim red-lit control space above the deck where radar screens glowed and young officers suddenly straightened at the sight of the Admiral entering beside an old civilian in a worn jacket. Mercer stepped to the wind display, studying vectors in silence. A lieutenant commander began explaining cross-current data, but stopped when Mercer lifted one hand. Move recovery pattern 7 degrees starboard. The room froze. Sir, the lieutenant commander said carefully, that contradicts software optimization. Mercer glanced at him. Your software is reading surface winds. Your pilots are descending through layered drift. Connor Reeves watched the exchange with the same unease he had felt when Mercer whispered bleed. It was happening again. Another truth older than systems logic pressing against modern certainty. Keegan did not hesitate. Shift pattern 7 degrees. Orders moved. Radios crackled. Then over headset came the first inbound pilot's voice, tense but controlled. Carrier control, turbulence dropped off. New vector is clean. Several officers exchanged stunned looks. A second pilot called moments later. Whoever adjusted the lane just saved me a hard trap. No one spoke. The room only listened to the proof arriving over radio. Reeves turned toward Mercer slowly. You have done this before. Mercer almost smiled. More than I remember. Then Keegan did something that stunned even his staff. He opened a secured drawer built into the flight control console and withdrew a weathered brass nameplate mounted on dark walnut. He said it before Mercer. The engraved words caught red light. Chief Aviation Troubleshooter Elias Mercer. Reeves stared. You served on this ship? Keegan shook his head. Before she was recommissioned, that plate was removed from her predecessor and archived. He looked at Mercer. I kept it because I thought legends should have a place to return to. Silence settled heavy and respectful. Mercer touched the edge of the plaque with one finger but said nothing. Then the radio cracked again, urgent but not fearful. Strike lead requests call sign confirmation for advisory source. The room looked to Keegan. The Admiral's expression changed, almost amused by destiny. He keyed the transmitter himself. Strike lead, advisory source is whisper actual. The channel went silent 2 seconds too long. Then a pilot's voice came back transformed. Whisper actual. Sir, my father flew under him. Connor Reeves felt the hair rise along his arms. Even now, the old man's name moved through generations like signal through static. And as storm clouds rolled beyond the carrier and inbound jets turned safely toward home, Reeves understood the night had ceased being about malfunctioned catapults long ago. It had become about something rarer. The moment-forgotten mastery returns and reminds the modern world what it once knew. The red lights of primary flight control cast long shadows across steel consoles as inbound fighters began checking in one by one, each voice steadier than the last. The altered recovery lane held. Crosswinds that had threatened to throw the pattern into chaos seemed to bend around the 7-degree shift Elias Mercer had ordered, as if old instincts had reached farther than software ever could. Lieutenant Connor Reeves stood behind Mercer now not as a skeptic, but as a student watching a discipline he had never been taught. Each call from the returning strike package carried a strange undercurrent of disbelief. Smooth approach. Deck picture is clean. Whisper actual still reading the wind. The old call sign moved through headsets like a ghost re-entering service. Rear Admiral Thomas Keegan listened with the quiet satisfaction of a debt finally coming due. Then the final inbound pilot checked fuel margins lower than expected. The room tightened. The aircraft had one safe trap left before divert became likely. Radar showed the jet descending through a stubborn lateral drift the software still insisted was manageable. Mercer studied the scope, head tilted slightly as though listening past the electronics. Tell him come in 2 knots slower. The operations officer hesitated. That puts him outside standard approach. Mercer looked at him. Standard approach is not landing this pilot tonight. Keegan nodded once. Transmit it. The order went out. Silence followed except for radio hiss and the carrier's low metallic heartbeat. Then the pilot's voice returned. Correcting, drift easing. I have the ball. Even seasoned officers exhaled together. Connor Reeves gripped the edge of a console hard enough his knuckles whitened. He realized he was praying for a man he had never met and trusting a method he had mocked hours earlier. The landing signal officer's calls came clipped and calm. Power, hold it, little right, hold. Then through thick control room glass they saw the fighter break through sea mist, hook catching the arresting wire in a burst of sparks no one could hear but everyone felt. The aircraft stopped clean. The room erupted, not in shouting, but in stunned relieved laughter that sounded almost disbelieving. The pilot's voice came back over the channel. Whoever Whisper Actual is. I owe him a drink. A few officers grinned. Mercer only lowered his eyes. Tell him to buy one for his father too. Keegan laughed softly, then did something none in the room expected. He turned to the assembled officers and said, Stand by for honors. Reeves thought he had misheard. But the admiral stepped back from Mercer, came sharply to attention, and rendered a formal salute. One by one every officer in primary flight control followed. Even the youngest ensign snapped upright. In red combat lighting the room transformed into something ceremonial, almost sacred. Mercer looked genuinely uncomfortable. Tom, this is unnecessary. Keegan answered without dropping his salute. No, Chief. It is overdue. Connor Reeves felt his throat tighten. Hours ago he had joked about a museum relic on his flight line. Now he was saluting a man whose whispered word had saved launches, guided pilots through weather, and quietly corrected the arrogance of an entire carrier. Mercer returned the salute slowly, almost reluctantly, and when he did, the room held stillness deeper than applause. Then a deck runner appeared breathless at the hatch. Sir, the crew on Catapult 3 is assembled on the flight deck. They requested permission. Keegan looked toward Mercer with a knowing expression. Requested what? The runner swallowed. To line the deck for Chief Mercer's walk back. Reeves stared. Hundreds of sailors outside, forming ranks for one forgotten veteran. Mercer closed the leather pouch, and for the first time that night a faint weariness touched his face. Not from age, but from the weight of memory returning. As they descended toward the wind and steel below, Connor Reeves understood the final reversal was no longer about machines or missions. It was about an old man once overlooked being honored by the very institution he had quietly carried. The hatch opened and Atlantic wind rushed over them again, carrying salt, turbine heat, and the low, endless music of the sea. But the flight deck Elias Mercer stepped onto no longer resembled the one where a few hours earlier he had been mistaken for a relic in the wrong place. From Catapult 3 to the island superstructure, sailors stood in two silent lines under amber deck lamps, cranials tucked under arms, faces lit by respect too solemn for ceremony alone. No order barked them into place. They had formed there because something inside them had recognized honor and wanted to answer it. Mercer stopped when he saw the ranks. For the first time that night his composure nearly faltered. Rear Admiral Thomas Keegan stepped beside him. "Walk the deck, Chief." Mercer gave a faint shake of the head. "I only fixed a launch." Keegan looked at him the way one old aviator looks at another. "No. You reminded a carrier who it is." So Elias Mercer began walking. Boots touched steel slowly, almost reluctantly, while sailors on both sides came to attention as he passed. Some saluted. Some only stood straighter. One young mechanic who had laughed at him hours earlier now held tears he did not understand. Connor Reeves walked a pace behind, silent, carrying the old leather pouch without realizing he still held it. At the bow they stopped where black ocean stretched beyond the ship in moonlit swells. The wind was colder there. Mercer rested one hand on the safety rail and looked out as though seeing more than water. "We used to listen to the sea before launches," he said quietly. Reeves asked, "Why did you leave the service, Chief?" Mercer smiled faintly. "I never did. The paperwork left me." Even Keegan laughed softly at that. Then the Admiral reached into his coat and withdrew the weathered brass nameplate from primary flight control. Without ceremony he placed it into Reeves's hands. "Lieutenant, tomorrow this goes back where it belongs." Reeves looked down at the engraved name. "In flight control." Keegan shook his head. "No. In the training wing." He turned to the gathered crew, voice carrying over wind and steel. "From this day forward, no launch officer on this carrier qualifies until they can explain why pressure lies, why steel sings, and why some systems breathe." Through a bleed line. Quiet grins moved through the ranks. Mercer lowered his head slightly, almost embarrassed by the tribute. Then from the dark sky a distant pair of running lights appeared, one of the recovered fighters circling once over the carrier before heading home. Its pilot keyed the common frequency. The speaker near the bow crackled. "Whisper actual, this is strike lead. We copied your guidance. My father says to tell you he still owes you that drink." Laughter rose across the deck, warm and human. Mercer looked toward the sound, eyes bright in the deck glow. "Tell him I am still waiting." Later, long after the launches were complete and the carrier settled into midnight routine, Connor Reeves found Mercer alone beside Catapult 3, fingers resting lightly on the steel shuttle as if saying goodbye to an old friend. "Sir," Reeves said, struggling for words, "what was the one thing I missed tonight?" Mercer looked at him kindly. "You thought mastery announces itself." He tapped the deck once. "Most of the time, it whispers." At dawn a helicopter lifted from the carrier with Elias Mercer aboard. The deck crew gathered in silence as it rose into gold morning haze. Reeves stood at attention until it vanished. Years later sailors would still tell the story of the night two dead catapults came alive because a forgotten veteran whispered one word, but Connor Reeves remembered something else. Not the repairs. Not the salutes. He remembered learning that respect is not commanded by rank or demanded by noise. It is earned in quiet competence, carried through generations, and returned when the world finally recognizes whose hands kept it flying. Some machines remember the hands that once kept them alive. So do men.